Good morning, Professor Gaddis. I'm Madan Chawla, so I was the person emailing.
Yeah, I was a little puzzled by that, but
yeah, sometimes I sign with my first name and sometimes with my second. So sorry about that.
Yeah, it's a little bit confusing, but that's fine. Sorry, I called you Ms. then, as I may have done.
Yeah, I did, but yeah, you did, but it's not a problem. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So before we go live, I was thinking of showing you or telling you what my questions would be, like just a few of them.
That's fine. Sure, go ahead.
So most of us actually read Graham Allison's book, Destined for War. Yes. So we were going to try to put your book or your concepts in relation to his theory,
sure,
if that's not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had a more curious question, which is what was one of the most common questions you got on your book?
Mm-hmm.
And then we have a question, well, we have some other questions, but the most important one would be, where did I put it? What's your favorite part of the book? So it's a question that most people don't ask authors. And then we have some other small questions, but let's see if we have enough time to talk about everything. Mm-hmm. So I'll try to go live now.
Okay.
Oh yeah, and thank you so much.
Sure. It's fun to do this.
And we're in Italy. I think I wrote.
All
right, so
I can tell.
Let's see, what should I do?
But you're all American expats, or you're expats from other countries as well?
I'm actually South Korean. Most of the others are Americans, and we've got a Ecuadorian, and I think we even have a Japanese.
Okay, fine.
But he never comes, so.
Right. All right, fine. Mm-hmm.
All right, there we go. I think everything's working. Almost. All right. Hi, everyone. It's the Bologna Book Club. Today we're with John Lewis Gaddis, professor on military and naval history. The New York Times considers him the dean of Cold War historians. And I actually read his Wikipedia page and I found some curious facts. For example, according to Wikipedia, Professor Gaddis suggested or recommended painting as a hobby to the 43rd president, or George W. Bush, which is a really curious fact. And before, one of the main questions we had, or one of the main curiosities we had, was putting the main concept of the book, which is, in the professor's words, potentially unlimited aspirations with necessarily limited capabilities. Sorry, I'm a bit nervous. And Graham Allison's book, Destined for War. So we were wondering what Professor Gaddis thought about America's grand strategy and maybe the Chinese grand strategy. And if Professor Gaddis actually thinks we're destined for war.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's nice to be in Bologna, and it's nice to have the trip so easy to get there. With regard to the aspirations and capabilities question, that's really just a definition of grand strategy, and it reflects a basic human dilemma, which is that there's always more out there that you want than you can actually get. And so you have to make tough choices. All of us do this in all aspects of life. And a certain strategy is required. If you're ordering a pizza, you might say this is not grand strategy, this is petite strategy or something like that. But if you're making life choices for yourself, if you're making them for a family, if you're making them in a school, if you're making them at running a nation or in running the world, then these are all grand issues to you from your own perspective. So that's all I meant by that simple definitional instinct, although it's simple enough that it sounds portentous and people think you've come up with something very deep, which I don't think that is. I think it's basically obvious, you know. As to Graham Allison's thesis, I think it's a good caution, but I don't think it's necessarily or has to be a valid prediction. And Graham would be the first to say the same, it seems to me. What he's called attention to is a pattern in history in which rising powers challenge established powers and then cause fears to develop that cause the established powers and the rising power to go to war. And he traces this all the way back to the Athenians and the Spartans. But as he points out, you know, for every 2 examples of wars that happened, there is at least 1 example of a war under similar circumstances that did not happen. One of the best examples is the rise of the United States in the 19th century, which Britain at that time, Great Britain, greatly feared. But in the end, it did not lead to an Anglo-American war, in part because the British also faced a rising German challenge and so managed to enlist the Americans in helping to contain the Germans. But that's one that did not happen in that way. One could even say the Cold War fits that pattern, because certainly the power of the Soviet Union was rising significantly as a result of its victory in World War II. But somehow the Soviet Union and the United States over a very long period of time, and with very dangerous weapons, did manage to avoid that. So it goes both ways, and I think the value in having something like Graham's thesis is that it forces you to look into each case and try to pick out what elements are characteristic of the current situation and which are not. And I think there's value in that. It's also very helpful to have a very splashy thesis, an easily understood thesis, because even leaders at the top can understand this. So we know that Xi Jinping at least is aware of the Thucydides trap. I'm sure Joe Biden is certainly aware of the Thucydides trap. And even if they may not understand it in any particularly sophisticated way, I think it's good to have them both with that caution in the back of their minds. So that's where I am on that.
It's actually really interesting that you mentioned Great Britain and the United States, because I think there was a book by Corey Shake on the transition, or the almost cousin-like relationship between
which was not there in the 19th century, and there were bitter rivalries, of course, in that period. So sure, it's good to recall that.
So we were wondering if, while you were talking, or while you were writing about the Peloponnesian War, if you had thought about Klaus Witz's concepts of ideal war and absolute war and real war, while writing about the emissaries sent by Athens to Sparta. I'm not sure if it's a relevant question, but it seemed pretty interesting to me.
Again, Clausewitz was making that distinction for instructional purposes. You have to remember, Clausewitz considers himself a teacher more than a historian, and he's writing for grand strategists. Remember also that Clausewitz is Prussian, and therefore thinks in a certain manner. And the whole German tradition of intellectual analysis was one of beginning with a great galloping abstraction, setting it out there in such an abstract way that it can never actually be achieved in reality, but saying this is the ideal form. It's almost Plato's argument about ideal forms. And then reality never quite comes up to it. And that was always Clausewitz's point. He, I don't think, was considering explicitly the Athenian-Spartan rivalry. I don't remember seeing anything about that on War. But I think that was just the way that teaching was done, certainly in the Prussian War Academy where he taught, and in those circles. And I suppose there is a certain value in it, but it has been confusing to a lot of people over the years because they don't quite understand that the ideal or the total absolute war concept was always seen by Klaus Vits as something that could never be achieved in reality because there are too many things that get in the way. Friction, for one thing, psychology, terror, all of these things. But the theory was very much revived in the Cold War period because people said, well, we do have a capacity now for absolute war with nuclear weapons. And that may be true. And that may be a valuable caution. And it probably makes Klaus Vits's work all the more relevant in the nuclear age, but not necessarily as a way for understanding the Athenian-Spartans rivalry, it seems to me.
I believe I've misspoke because what I wanted to say was many of us saw Klaus Vits all over in many of your pages, as in.
For sure. It's hard to write about grand strategy with regard to any topic without some reference to Klaus Vits. Klaus Vits pretty much said everything that needs to be said. So, for example, his concept of friction, what can go wrong, will go wrong. I would defy you to find any historical situation in which that has not been true. Of course, it's true. This whole question of psychology and the result of the impact of psychology on strategy of human nature, something Thucydides himself talked about, is very much animating Klaus Vits also. But there are some differences, and I think the great point of Klaus Vits is that you should never go into a war without having a clear political purpose. And that's what he means when he says war is a continuation of policy by other means. I don't think Thucydides would have disagreed with that, although he never quite said it in that way. But what he did say was that the Athenians, in going to war with Sparta, did so with a particular strategy in mind, which was that of distinguishing vital from peripheral interests, which had to do with building the long walls and all of that. And he says they lost sight of that purpose as time went on and wound up defeating themselves through a completely ridiculous invasion of Sicily some 15, 20 years later. And I think he would say that, I think we could say that that's a Clausewitzian critique of Athenian strategy, even though, again, Clausewitz himself never directly referenced it.
I'm sure you know this, but like for example, Foreign Affairs and most of the main news sources tend to underline the porcupine and the fox ideas and also the definition of grand strategy. But we were wondering if you thought other parts of your book should be brought to the public attention, to our attention, or.
Sure. Well, of course, I used as the framing device for the entire book the Isaiah Berlin distinction between hedgehogs, who are a kind of porcupine, and foxes. Same principle. The hedgehog knows one big thing, the fox knows many things. And Berlin's idea was that human nature, or human beings, can be divided according to that mentality. And I think that's a profound insight, not just about grand strategy, but about human nature itself. And I thought it would be interesting to pursue that with regard to a book on grand strategy. Isaiah Berlin would never have thought of himself as a grand strategist. Indeed, he would have thought that was very funny. But I think there are many elements in his thought that can be made to apply. And that's partly what this book is trying to do. The issue in Hedgehogs and Foxes is if you go back to the aspirations, capabilities, balancing act, and how do you make those difficult choices? I think it's fair to say that there are two different approaches to making them. There are those who would make them within some single great overriding intellectual concept, whatever that is, and that would be Berlin's Hedgehogs. And then there are those who would make them in terms of a rapid but quickly shifting survey of the environment, looking at the interaction of many different things, and that would be the fox. And that's an interesting distinction to make because of the work that's been done by Professor Tetlock and others on decision making, showing that foxes are much better at making predictions than hedgehogs are, but that hedgehogs tend to rise faster in organizations than foxes do. So how can we account for that paradox? It doesn't seem to make sense. But the answer appears to be that hedgehogs rise faster in organizations because they can do sound bites. They can speak and do it concisely and clearly and do it within, say, 30 seconds. They can do PowerPoint slides. They do all the things that cause you to rise in a modern organization. While foxes are always qualifying and hedging what they say and never quite getting to the point. But it's a paradox because the hedgehogs are so often wrong and the foxes are so often right. So with that in mind, the book was really an effort to try to see if the best attributes of hedgehogs and foxes could not be combined in the same individual. And I found a few people who, it seems to me, who I wrote about, did combine attributes of both. And I certainly found plenty of examples of people who failed to do that, failed disastrously to do that. So that's the other central point, I think, of the book, is that Berlин's animals.
I think the question was, what was your favorite part, or what do you think people should have noticed a bit more?
Oh, I don't know. All of those are favorite parts in the sense that each one of those chapters was a teaching unit in the course that I gave here for years with Paul Kennedy and Charlie Hill. So we all taught that course together, with three of us every day in front of the students. We all disagreed with each other in front of the students constantly, and were arguing and belly aching and complaining and all of that. And so it was a very lively seminar, and it was so it's hard to pick out favorites. Intellectually, the one that I got most excited about, I think, was the Klaus Vits chapter, because I started out thinking it would just be a chapter about Klaus Vits. But I also happened to teach a freshman seminar here at Yale for first semester freshmen, in which they read War and Peace, Tolstoy's War and Peace, every line of it, all 1,200 pages. And they get captivated by it. And having worked through that text several times, it suddenly became clear to me that Tolstoy and Clausewitz thought very much alike, despite one being a novelist and the other being a strategist, you know. And I was wondering just how could this be? And came to the conclusion that it had to do with common on-the-ground practical military experience, because Clausewitz fought in the war against the French in 1812 for the Russians. And then, of course, Tolstoy fought in the Caucasus and in the Crimean War some 50 years later, but wrote about the Great War of 1812 in War and Peace. And so they both had operational experience, and that's reflected, I think, in the very, very similar treatment of Napoleon's invasion of history, one fictional but with a firm grounding in reality, the other with a firm grounding in reality with view to suggesting timeless lessons, which is Clausewitz. And the more I got to working through this, the more parallels I found. It was almost as if they were speaking to each other, though of course they never met. And that was fun to think about. And I think it maybe offers a larger point that's worth keeping in mind, which is that grand strategy is not necessarily that has to be something that has to be highly abstract or highly complex or something that average people cannot do. It's beyond their capabilities. I don't believe that for a minute. It seems to me that many of the principles that come about of actual combat experience, which we would just say are common sense. How do you do this? How do you do that, etc. That these work up the line into grand strategic principles, and that the line between grand strategy at the top and simply the efficient organization for battle or for combat at the bottom of a military organization, the line is very clear, and the principles are not greatly different. And I think the skill of a novelist is that he's able to show at the ground level better than the theorist can what's going on. But even Klaus Vits uses fictional scenarios to illustrate his principles as well. So there are great similarities there. And I don't think anybody had ever pointed that out before. So I was rather proud of that point. And it's one of these things that you don't set out to do, but writing a book surprises you, and it always does. So you learn from writing.
Wow, that's really interesting because writing is really a way to discover new ideas and also think through different scenarios or different
writing is that, and of course teaching is that also.
This is another question I got, and my friend's insisting that I ask you. He's wondering if you could give us your take on what is the United States grand strategy, or what is it's a bit of a I think it's a bit of a too complex of a question, but they're insisting so.
Well, it would have been easy to answer that question in the Cold War, it seems to me. I think that despite the concerns that many people had that a democracy could not sustain a grand strategy over a long period of time, I think we actually did this, and I think we did it more successfully than the Soviet Union did. I think that began to fall apart with the American victory in the Cold War and the fact that it was a so-called unilateral moment. And being the greatest power in the world and having no competition really was a disincentive to clear thinking about grand strategy. Adversity is what forces you to think about strategy. And if you're fat and happy and comfortable and safe, you have no particular incentive to think about grand strategy. And so I think a lot of particular issues, disconnected issues, simply took hold. And America drifted in that period from the early 1990s onward. And various things bad things happen to you when you are drifting. One thing you can do is to make unnecessary enemies, for example. And I think we did that very quickly with the Russians by expanding NATO without quite understanding why we were expanding NATO. NATO had a very clear purpose in its original formulation. But was it meant to include the Baltic states, parts of the former? No, I don't think so. So that was an example of this. We pursued a misguided strategy, it seems to me, with China in the sense of thinking about the Sino-American relationship solely in terms of economic benefits and assuming that the Chinese would see the global economy and the relationship to government as we did, and that they would themselves, of their own accord, become stakeholders, part of the international economic system. And that has proven to be a grievously great miscalculation, it seems to me, as well. And then maybe in one other sense of miscalculations, it's a pretty obvious point that no grand strategy can be any stronger than the nation that it serves, whose purposes it serves. And if that nation is hollowing out from within, if its internal problems are festering to the extent that they risk bringing about a collapse, that can have an impact on grand strategy. And looking at the history of the Soviet Union in the Brezhnev era, the so-called era of stagnation, should have taught us that. We were well aware of that problem and of the implications of it for Soviet grand strategy. But look at what we've done to ourselves over the last, we the Americans, over the last 20 years or so, in terms of allowing such great gaps in equality and in social conditions, economic conditions, race relations here at home, to be neglected, so that it's really as if we are two countries now. One country has one foot in the West Coast and the other foot in the East Coast, and the other country is what's in between, flyover country. And that's a profoundly unhealthy situation. And no wonder the position of the United States has weakened, and certainly the Trump administration greatly accelerated that process in all kinds of ways. So I think there is the potential now for an American grand strategic revival. I think it probably takes a centrist to lead it, which Joe Biden certainly is. But whether he can muster the discipline and particularly the votes in the Congress that are necessary to achieve that is going to be a real question. It's going to be an uphill battle for sure.
I just wanted to see if I understood what you said. So I understood that practically what you said is that a major power or a dominant nation it's very difficult for a major power or a dominant nation to have a grand strategy, because just maintaining power isn't an objective. Could it be interpreted in that way?
Oh, maintaining power can easily be an objective, but I don't think it's a wise one. I think you maintain power for some purpose. And the question of what your purpose is the Klaus Vitsian question. What's the objective in the first place? So I think that's the more important issue here for sure.
But couldn't it be said that up to now the United States' main strategy was spreading democracy, or trying to get closer to the end of history? I might dare say.
No, not necessarily, because first of all, we have never had a consistent policy of trying to spread democracy. We've talked about spreading democracy when it was convenient to us. But if that meant overthrowing reliable authoritarian allies, we would clearly make a lot of exceptions. And the history of the Cold War is full of that. So yes, that was one point. Secondly, spreading democracy is fine if one can assume that all cultures in the world are equally enthusiastic about democracy and need it and want it and prefer it to other systems. And that is not true either. Countries are different, cultures are different. And the right to vote is very important for sure. But so is the right to be fed, not to be hungry. And that may be more important in certain societies for sure. I'm sure it has been. So we have been a little bit monomaniacal on some of these points and have not kept them in the proper perspective, it seems to me. We've too much been hedgehogs, and we have not been foxes enough, it seems to me.
We're almost out of time, but the same friend's asking me if you could give us the same vision from a European perspective. So what could a European grand strategy be?
Well, I think the European grand strategy is one of surviving when caught in between two larger forces. And that means certainly the US on the one hand, but it means the rising forces, rising tides of authoritarianism on the other hand. Chiefly Chinese, but also partly Russian. What has happened is that Russia and China today have a lot more common interests than they did at the time in the last period of the Cold War, and are apt to act in common. And then there are other powers in which authoritarian temptations are taking hold. Turkey, for example, Poland, Hungary, etc. And so the real question for the Europeans is going to be how to survive within that. Up until this point, they have thought almost entirely in terms of economics. And the European Union has been largely an economic organization that is now trying to take over or take on some political characteristics. But it does not have the constitution that will make that possible. Its constitution resembles that of the old Polish Diet, when one person could veto action in any situation. And so it's very difficult for it to be a serious political power. It's just not structured for that. It will perhaps evolve that structure, I think, to some extent. That's going on. But for the moment, Europe is not a superpower, and it's caught in between some superpowers. And it's going to have to balance these. And it may be more acted upon than acted by. I think that would be fair to say. where it is right now.
I'll just ask you one last question because I don't want to take too much time. But a friend of mine's asking if this means that there's going to be a pivot back to America, or if this means that the ring of islands around China and all the American capabilities are going to be brought back to the States.
Well, one of the points that George Kennan always made about grand strategy, he was talking about the Soviet Union, but I think it applies elsewhere, is that quite often the strongest element of containment actually comes from within, because great powers can contain themselves through the stupid decisions that they make, through their own failures. And Kennan said of the Soviet Union, Stalin's Soviet Union, that it would in time defeat itself. In this way, Kennan was standing Marx on his head. Remember, Marx said capitalism carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Kennan said, well, communism does so even more. And I think that is still a very valid insight today. So yes, there are a lot of things about China and its economic achievements that have profoundly impressed people all over the world. But this is being moderated and to some extent attenuated by the increasing authoritarianism of China. So the Chinese cannot crack down on the Uyghurs, for example, and expect them to continue to have very cordial relations with the Muslims, remaining Muslims of Central Asia. They cannot crack down on islands like Taiwan and Hong Kong without generating fears in other islands and other small countries along that periphery. And we see that already happening. So for these kinds of crackdowns, there is a price, and the Chinese are already paying it. And it runs the risk for them of linking up with two other great weaknesses which they have, which is one, the great difficulty which nobody has ever solved of actually running a command economy by command. Economies, great economies, are simply too complex to work with central planning. And I still don't know anyone who has successfully managed that. And as they move more towards central planning and cut back on the market system, I think they're asking for trouble in that regard. The other great problem is the obvious one. They've never solved the succession problem. So they have abolished term limits. And what this means is that they're locked into President Xi for as long as he chooses to be there. But President Xi, as he gets older and older and older, is very unlikely to get wiser and wiser and wiser, just the opposite. Chairman Mao's senescence was a very good example of that. So was Stalin's. So have those been of other monarchs in history. And what do? You just have to wait for someone to go through all of the stages of senility, finally die, and then at that point you can change your system. Look at what the Americans have done. Just last November, we changed our system. We had a leader who was taking us, many people thought, in a very dangerous direction. And we kicked him out. And he did not go easily, as we know. And we still kicked him out, and he's out. And that's a pretty impressive performance. The Constitution held, the safeguards held. And this may well have been, almost inadvertently, the greatest and most successful American achievement of so far in the 21st century, I think.
Wow, that was really, really interesting. I'm just going to say one last thing, if I may. I know you're a very busy person. I'm sorry about that. Well, it's so if I'm understanding everything correctly, you're saying that China isn't a threat because China has so many internal problems that it can't become a threat.
No, I'm not saying that. China clearly, in many ways, is a threat. And through the rising tensions is a threat of military confrontation in the South China Sea. There are other dangers as well. And remember that Wars can start by inadvertence. You don't have to start. You don't have to have deliberate intent to start a great war. Look at what happened with World War One. It was just one that nobody wanted that got out of hand, and it was horrible. So that kind of war by inadvertence, war as a result of an arms race, war as a result of posturing, could easily happen, and that can, with modern weapons, that can endanger both sides as well. I think we have to remember nuclear weapons still exist, so there is that great deterrent to risk taking that certainly did not exist in 1914, and helps to explain how 1914 could have happened, but how something like it did not happen in the Cold War. So those constraints are still there. But for those who would say that the two economies are so intertwined that they could never, that the countries running them could never go to war with each other, they have forgotten the first great age of globalization, which was the pre-World War I era, when the economies of the European states, Germany, England, France, all were deeply intertwined, and still war happened. So economics alone is no protection against this. What's required, I think, is thinking ecologically, not breaking the world down into academic disciplines in the way that we break up our universities and sometimes our teaching in universities, but realize that what leaders have to deal with on a day-to-day basis is a whole panoply of problems, some of which are military, some of which are economic, some of which are psychological, some of which are internal, some of which may actually have to do with their own personal stability or lack of stability or whatnot. Can they stay off Twitter, for example, which is a very good thing to do, I think, for a leader in the light of recent experience. Stay off Twitter without being banned by Twitter. That's probably the best suggestion for future leadership, I think.
My last question is, are you a hedgehog or a fox?
I think I'm probably by temperament more of a fox, but I would like to think that it's possible to be both. And what that really involves is something F. Scott Fitzgerald once talked about. He once wrote that the sign of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold contradictory ideas in the mind at the same time without going bananas. He didn't use bananas, but anyway. Something like that, I think, is what's required. Life is full of contradictions. And anybody who tries to wipe out contradictions is risking some kind of authoritarianism. It's bound to fail. And that was Isaiah Berlin's point as well. That's what he called positive liberty. For him, negative liberty was much better, which means respecting contradictions, realizing that there are things that have to be lived with but cannot necessarily be resolved. And sometimes the tension between them is actually the healthiest situation. So that's where I think I would like to put myself, but who knows? I'm just a teacher, that's all.
Thank you so very much. Professor Gaddis, thank you so much. Okay. And I'll turn off the live now.
Okay. Thanks for having me.